I think CrossFit has the most robust methodology for fitness out of all of it. They've taken something that has always been there. This type of training has always been there, but through them making a sport of it, we're seeing details of it that we never would have seen without it being a sport. Where do you think that CrossFit really gets it right? Like, and then where do you contrast that with where do you think CrossFit gets it wrong?
Well, I think the CrossFit's definition of fitness, work capacity across broad time and modal domain, is probably the most accurate definition of fitness that exists. And CrossFit has done such a good job of contrasting the academic assessment of, various capacities. You can think about them as constructs, right? Like VO2 max, lactate threshold, peak wattage on a wind gate. And like, you can create a battery of tests and you can say that someone is this fit. But what I like about CrossFit's methodology and the way that they test fitness is they test fitness performance. And in the end, it doesn't really matter how big your VO2 max is. It matters what you can do on the field or on the trail or in the water or whatever it is. It's the performance aspect that really is where fitness is truly tested. Like, you might test your VO2 max in the gym, but if you want to know who the fittest is, you put them through a battery of races and time trials and lifts and, endurance tests and things like that. And you see who has the fastest time, the heaviest lift, the highest jump. And it's that performance metric that I think that CrossFit kind of clicked me over to. It's like, well, let's stop worrying about these guys, VO2 max so much, and let's worry more about, performance in the field, in the pool, whatever sport you're working with. Like, let's worry about performance. So I think their assessment of general fitness is so good. Like, that's what CrossFit, I think, has done right. Yeah. Whether or not the CrossFit methodology, the application of their training methodology results in improvement in that kind of fitness, I think is debatable, right? Like, I coach very high level CrossFit athletes, and they only do a small amount of CrossFit within a training week. If you consider CrossFit to be primarily Metcons, most of their training is structured, strength programs, periodized strength programs, periodized conditioning programs, gymnastics skill work, which is part of CrossFit, right? Like, if you look at the pyramid, the argument can be made, like, the base of the pyramid is you got to get your movement down, and then you work your way up to virtuosity, and start weightlifting your gymnast. Like, there's something to be said for that. Like, that generally is right. But I don't think that the over reliance on variance that CrossFit tends to portray, and it may not even be that CrossFit themselves, like, the original intent of CrossFit wasn't like it's constant variance, but it wasn't like unplanned randomness. Yeah. But the way that it's interpreted in the market and applied in the market, especially at the affiliate level, and not all affiliates, to be clear, but I think it's probably not the best way to build work capacity across broad time and modal domain. And we've seen that bear out in the training of high level CrossFit performers, that they don't do constantly varied training. They do periodized, structured training for the most part. There are elements of constant variance, but that's what built the highest levels of work capacity across broad time and modal domain. So it's important to keep in mind that, if you're training for the test, and the test is testing for the highest level of fitness, which is work capacity across broad time and modal domain, doesn't mean doing constantly varied training in order to improve that.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah. And I think it's a fascinating conversation, because that is the difference between constantly varied versus something like a high rocks, where everything is laid out prior to, exactly what the training is. The same as I think it's 9 events or 9 different sections. 8 stations. The 1K run before every station. Yeah. So that is pretty hyper specialized. You can spend all 12 months of the year training those things to get better at it, because it's not going to change. So I think just from my perspective and a fitness perspective, that we can talk all day about some of the movements in CrossFit that we don't like. We can talk about all this different stuff, but I think it has done the best job of advancing our definition of fitness overall. But
100%. Yeah, and you reference High Rocks, and I love High Rocks. I mean, I'm currently, my wife is training for a High Rocks race. Ellie, your wife is training I'm training your wife for a High Rocks race.
Yeah.
I have a whole bunch of athletes that are doing it. I think it's awesome. I love fitness racing. I mean, we talked about that at the beginning of the podcast. I think this is awesome, but that's not a good test of fitness, right? The CrossFit Games are the current best test of fitness that exists. High Rocks is not a good test of fitness. They're testing a very single or maybe two-dimensional aspect of fitness. How can you push the heavy sled, and do you have a high enough lactate threshold to run for 50 minutes or so at really high outputs? That's not broad time and modal domain. It's not a great test of fitness, but it is a great test of endurance and a little bit of strength, or maybe your ability to express strength under fatigue. So it's awesome for that. But I think those are two very different things, right? The CrossFit Games is this truly well-rounded test of fitness for the most part. They even leave out some of their own stuff, right?
Yeah.
They need to test broad jump. That's part of that. That should probably be tested, or some, triple jump or something like that. Those aspects should probably be tested in there. They're not. You're not assessing someone's explosiveness by doing 30-inch box jumps and stepping down on the other side for 10 reps. That's not testing explosiveness. That's testing bounding endurance. It's a completely different thing than, testing explosiveness. But regardless, I think it is currently the best. The games themselves is currently the best test of fitness that exists. And I think things like High Rock are awesome. They're much more discrete skills. They remind me a lot more of swimming, right? So in swimming, I swam the 50 freestyle, I swam the 100 freestyle, I swam the 100 butterfly, I swam the 100 breaststroke. And for every single one of those, I knew how many strokes I was going to take, how many dolphin kicks I would do off each wall, how long I would streamline before I initiated my pullout on breaststroke. That stuff to a T. You've rehearsed it 1,000 times, 10,000 times in training, over and over and over, and refined it, and cut off a 1/10 of a second here, a 1/10 of a second here, a 1/10 of a second here. And it's really, a very discrete skill. High Rocks is like that. It's a much longer race than what I was doing, but it's still a discrete skill. You know what pace you're going to run for the first one. You know what pace you're going to run for the second one. You know how you're going to break the wall ball. You know how far and how many of the burpee broad jumps you're going to have to do. So you know a lot about the test, right? Versus CrossFit, which kind of exists in this intermediate kind of gray zone in between these discrete skills where you know exactly what you're doing, and field sport or ball sport where it's chaos, right? You never know each play what's going to happen because people are going to be in different places. You might rehearse your plays, but things don't always pan out the way that you rehearse them. And then CrossFit sits in the middle where you have a good idea. You know that thrusters are going to be out there. You know some form of muscle up. You know you're going to probably climb ropes. You're going to walk on your hands. You're going to do handstand push-ups. You're probably going to row. You might run. You might swim at the CrossFit Games. Probably going to do a max. You'll do a barbell cycling test. I can keep going.
Yeah.
But there's probably 30 plus domains that are going to be tested, and you know what those domains are, and you're going to do CrossFit. Mm-hmm. So it's a discrete thing in that the skills that you can train for all the skills, and you can train for each of the domains that you can expect to see. But you don't know what the exact tests are going to be. So it sits in this middle zone between highly discrete things. And I would say the most discrete one is sprint running, where they know they're timed out, their steps off the block. They know exactly when they're going to full stride and all that. That's as discrete as it gets. Or a thrower, a field thrower. And then you go all the way on the other side, which is American football, rugby, where it's just soccer. It's reactive and chaotic. And CrossFit sits kind of in the middle.